So I would like to introduce you to Dr. Stephen Kress and Project Puffin and National Audubon.
So thank you very much. And Stacy, it has indeed been a pleasure. 25 years with Hardy Boat under your ownership. Vern Lewis was the previous owner, 5 years with him, 30 years there. How many people have been out on those boats? Thousands of people have been on the boats, and hopefully the Puffins have helped inspire many of those people to appreciate the impact we can have together. I'm representing Project Puffin, happen to be the one that started it, but there have been hundreds of other people that have helped me make this project a success, many of which are in the room today, and I hope that my staff that's here, you'll have a chance to meet with them. They'll be back at the back tables. If you didn't meet the giant puffin, I heard somebody say, are you real? And I'm sure that Noah inside of that knows that he is very real and probably very hot. Say hello to Noah, our giant puffin. So tonight, 45 years. This is our anniversary year. 45 years for Project Puffin on the Maine coast, trying to do something helpful for seabirds on the ground, on the island, and so we have this chance tonight to share some of the highlights. So I think I'm going to move right on to a bit of history and also to remind you of another very important anniversary. This is the anniversary of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act this year. This act passed by Congress in 1918 stopped the hunting of birds for their feathers, for decorating women's hats. And that was also the beginning of the Audubon movement that helped pass that law. And today we're fighting to keep that law strong and to keep it as the backbone of bird protection that it is. Happily, birds can no longer be shot for decorating hats. Their eggs, their nests are all protected. And when I came to Maine in 1969 as a bird life instructor at the Audubon camp on Hog Island, I was struck by the fact that the birds were back, and there were lots of birds to look at, but there were no puffins. There was one small colony way out on Matinicus Rock. You had to go offshore out of Rockland, about 20 miles out, to get to Matinicus Rock. Those birds were the survivors of the plume hunting days, but they had not spread back to any of their historic sites, like the Egg Rocks in Muscongas Bay, where I visited with the Audubon campers. And it seemed to me a shame that we knew that those birds were thriving there, but people shot too many for food, too many birds were taken for feathers, and isn't there a chance, isn't there a way to maybe bring them back? I didn't have the answer to that question. But I thought maybe after a few summers, I could figure that out and I'd move on to something else. And here I am 45 years later telling you this longer story. Some birds immediately thrived following the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, including herring gulls. All it took to bring the herring gulls back from the feather hunting era was bird protective laws, some wildlife wardens on a few islands, creating some sanctuaries, and they came back, but they had help from many people. This kind of help. At landfills, coastal landfills were common in the late 1960s when I first came here, and the birds didn't have to fly far from the egg rocks to get food. But I knew that feeding behind boats and feeding in landfills was making all the difference for gulls, but you'd never see a puffin at a landfill or behind a boat. There was something different there. The puffins that were missing from eastern egg rock for 100 years, they needed something else. I didn't know what it was at that point, but I hoped that I could figure it out. And that's what sort of led me down the pathway toward creating this project. And it's also led me down the pathway to understanding why it is that some birds come back and others don't. Herring gulls and blackback gulls not only eat food readily, all kinds of food, highly adaptable around humans, but they have short migrations. They don't go too far away. And they get off to an earlier start, the more migratory birds. The longer you migrate, often the greater the problems a bird has. And some birds at that time, we didn't even know where they went. No one knew where puffins even went, but we know they disappeared somewhere into the open ocean. So the gulls came back, but the more I started thinking about this, the more I realized it wasn't just the gulls that were coming back with bird protection. Lots of birds were coming back, like great horned owls. As the coastal forest grew up, lots of great horned owls. Gulls and owls helped to inhibit other birds from coming back, and that was part of the problem that I eventually began to have some vision of. Other birds needed a helping hand to come back. Peregrine falcons, bald eagles, and ospreys, all of which had been decimated by both hunting and later by DDT. They were coming back because there were groups out there working to bring these groups back. The peregrine had the falconers, and that was a dedicated, well-funded group that was going to bring back the fastest bird in the world. And of course, our national bird had lots of friends because it was our national bird, and eagles are amazing. Ospreys followed because they too are beautiful, and they were friends that would do things for them. But at that point, in the late 1960s, the puffins didn't seem to have any friends. In fact, seabirds, the only thing people were doing to help seabirds' active management was to maybe put some signs up to say, don't land on this island. And I began thinking, yeah, that's probably true. What else can we do? And that's when I began starting to think like a puffin. And I realized that you had to be very aware of predators, because predators are so good at what they do. And the increase in bald eagles, for example, was in fact already starting to affect other populations of birds, a trend that has increased more and more. And the resurgence of peregrines, again, is affecting more and more birds. But the puffin is in the middle of the food chain. Little fish below it, big birds above it. How do you reinsert this lost species? And other highly migratory birds as well, like terns and razorbills, all of which were kind of missing in this reconstructed bird communities that I was seeing on the Maine coast. And there were other things happening too. Changes in fashion were not only affecting birds, but affecting coats, and people weren't hunting mink so much anymore. And the coastal forests were now great places for mink to grow up. So mink were now much more abundant by the early 70s, and they were swimming out to islands. You know, a mink can swim up to 2 miles of open ocean. I didn't know that when I started. In fact, I knew none of this when I started, trying to think about how to reinsert puffins back into a nesting community. There were critics all along the way that were saying, oh, this probably won't work. And why bother anyways? Because you can't hunt a puffin, you can't eat puffins in North America. And besides, if you want to see puffins, you just go north and you go to Canada or you go to Iceland. That's where the puffins are. So why bother along the coast here? Even though we know why they disappeared from the hunting era. We had to begin thinking like a puffin, thinking about where they should live. And this map I'm showing you now is a result of that kind of thinking. The idea eventually emerged that the best places to do seabird restoration was on the outer islands of the Maine coast. There are, by some counts, 4,000 or more islands along this coast, if you count the rocky ledges. And most of those are too close to the mainland, and mink and otter swim freely among these inshore islands. Some of them even freeze up in the winter, and the predators can walk out there. The further you go from the mainland, the safer they are. And if you look at the history, that's where the birds were, and that's where I wanted to try to get them back to. And all of this work started right there on Eastern Egg Rock, which is one of the outermost islands in Muscongas Bay. Project Puffin's summer office is right there on the mainland, opposite Hog Island. And it was about an 8-mile run out to Eastern Egg Rock, some 5 miles from New Harbor, to get there. Egg Rock, as you see it from the air, looks like a lot of offshore islands, but you have to take a closer look and you realize this island has a lot of huge boulders around the edge. Most islands don't have those. Now I realize the reason that puffins historically nested there was that the chunks of rock break off. The geology is in parallel fault lines, and when the winter storms get under that rock, it breaks off these chunks, and that's why the puffins are there. The soil is too shallow for them to nest in. So puffins, their reputation and their image is certainly much bigger than they are in lifetime. They're only about, a big one is only like 10 inches tall. They look sort of like a penguin, but they're not penguins at all. They're not even remotely related to penguins. They're related to murres and razorbills and guillemots and auklets and merlets. But in Maine, Egg Rock was the historic southern limit of where puffins nested. In order to bring them back to Egg Rock, I needed to learn as much as I could about puffins. And here's a few things that were known at the time. It was known when I started this project that they lived underground in burrows. They laid one egg. Both male and female incubated the egg. The parents incubated that egg for about 6 weeks. Another 6 weeks passed before the chick would fledge, and it would head off to sea by itself. No parents would be with it. So whatever condition it was in when it left, that was it. And instinctively, magically, they somehow were making a map, a mystery that remains still clear, that no one is sure how they do this, but they're making a map while they're growing up or when they're leaving. And they head off to sea making this map, and later they come back to nest near the place where they hatched. I thought at the time that they would come back, all of them, to Egg Rock, or at least I hoped they would come back there. And all I would have to do was to bring some there, raise them and let them go, and they would come back, and that would be it. But there's much more to this story. And it was much more complicated. The little chicks. It was all about the chicks. That's the stage that I began realizing that maybe there was an opportunity here, because the little chicks could be raised without the parents. Zoos had done this. They demonstrated that all you had to do was drop some fish in front of it and the chicks would eat it. That was good, I figured. And because they headed off to sea naturally by themselves, that was good, because we weren't going to go off taking care of them after they left. And because they'd come back to where they hatched, that was good too. So I added all that up together, and we started Project Puffin in 1973. The idea itself, the kernel of the idea, started about 4 years earlier when I began trying to talk this idea up, get the permissions, convince people, and it took eventually 13 government permits to move some puffins over the international border that they normally fly over without any papers. So with 13 government permits in hand, I managed to make my way to Newfoundland in 1973 and collect the first 6 puffin chicks. They were brought to Hog Island, hand-reared, and eventually were released at Egg Rock. Over the next several years, we began improving the methodology. The details are too long to get into tonight, but let it be said, this was all blind, trial and error type science. We had a vision, and we had a lot of dedication, not much money, because these are non-game birds, and nobody was putting money into a bird that's still numbered in the millions in the northern hemisphere. But we invented these methods, and here's what happened. We moved chicks in cases like that. We hand-reared them on Egg Rock with a diet of thawed fish with supplemented vitamins. We watched as the puffin chicks started coming out during the day sometimes, but more often at night, exercising their wings. Sitting out there at night, we could watch them walk quietly over the rocks. And brave little creatures, they just leaped instinctively into the ocean and paddled off, all dark plumaged, into the night. And then they would be out of sight. And over the span of a couple of weeks, we would be releasing up to 100 of these birds into Mascongas Bay, heading off tonight, pairing little bands on their legs. somehow hoping that they were, in fact, making that important map and they would eventually come back, but we had no assurance they would because no one had ever done this before. And after 4 years of waiting and realizing, after 4 years, that nothing had come back, I began realizing, well, we got potentially a problem with this project. And the funders that were funding this were saying, Steve, where are the puffins already? We're not going to keep putting money in. And the government in Canada was saying, we're not going to give you any more permits if something doesn't come back. And that's when I had to think like a puffin again. And I began thinking, what could be missing here? Maybe they're coming back, but they're just scared to come ashore because normally there would be other puffins there. We'd already chased off the gulls. We learned that the gulls would eat them. And we knew that they wouldn't land. So our presence scared off the gulls that were nesting there. But they weren't coming ashore. And that's when we came up with the idea of putting out some decoys. And put out some decoys, and the most amazing thing happened. On a rock where we had 2 wooden decoys, almost immediately there was a third bird. And the third one had 2 legs on it, and the legs were decorated with bands. This was amazing. I was beside myself because I had waited 4 years of sitting out there rearing these birds, myself and others, so we're working on the project without any shred of any evidence that anything was going to happen. And more came, and they attracted each other. And we came up with the idea of using mirrors, and we put out a box with a reflective surface and discovered that this was even more powerful than the decoys. They would stay longer with the mirrors than they would with the decoys, because when you look at yourself in the mirror, there's always something moving. And that's what was happening. The combination of mirrors and decoys brought more and more puffins, and the puffins themselves were like living decoys to attract even more. And so this social attraction of the birds became increasingly important. We realized, of course, they needed each other, because if you're just the only puffin on a rock, and the peregrine falcon comes by at 200 miles an hour, it's not going to end pretty. And so they wanted other puffins, and the decoys gave them a little bit of confidence. And slowly, like kindling a fire, a spark that grew, we began seeing puffins. But they didn't stay. They'd fly away. They were nesting on Matinicus Rock now, our translocated Newfoundland puffins. And another 4 years passed. Now we're 8 years after leaving the first chick heading ashore, and still no puffins, because what we needed to see finally was a puffin with fish in its beak, because that would prove that there was a chick under the rock. And so on the 4th of July in 1981, we saw it finally. A puffin came zooming in with fish in its beak, and it dropped under the rocks, and it came out shortly thereafter without the fish, and that was the proof. That was evidence that after nearly 100 years, there was a puffin chick on Egg Rock again. Now, those of you that go out there on the Hardy boat and see the puffins flying around, you needed to hear this story tonight to know how important that is. I still tell people when I'm on the boat that every puffin is a miracle out there, because every puffin demonstrates what's possible if you stick with something long enough and you care enough and you want it to happen and you have some good luck. And it's all those things. Now I had, believe it or not, after waiting 8 years and puffins coming back with bands on, I had people saying, well, how do you know they wouldn't have come back anyways? I'll bet you can't do that again. And so we decided to take them up on that, and that's what led to the Seal Island project out of Rockland, Maine's largest historic nesting colony of Atlantic puffins. And the Maine coast was out on a place called Seal Island, which is now part of the Maine Coastal Islands National Wildlife Refuge. Seal Island is really out there. Matinicus Rock is only a little further, close to where there were puffins. Could we replicate this project there? Or would the puffins released there fly over to Matinicus Rock? What would happen? It turns out that we did set up a camp And it took another 8 years before any of our translocated puffins from Newfoundland released at Egg Rock nested there. But that was the beginning of a second colony. In total, 1,000 puffin chicks were moved to eastern Egg Rock. An additional 1,000 puffin chicks were moved to Seal Island to restore these two important Maine puffin nesting islands. Combined with Matinicus Rock, there are now 3 colonies in Midcoast, Maine. Now, where the puffins go in the winter, up to that point, still remained a mystery. They would leave Midcoast, Maine in August, and they would disappear. We had no idea where they were going. Until a few years ago, the development of little geolocators, they're called, that measure the length of the day and the time of year, gives you a rough estimate. And so we have since discovered, and I'm going to share this discovery with you, that our Midcoast Maine puffins fly up to Canada, it seems. Most of them go into the western part of the Gulf of St. Lawrence. They spend a couple of months there, and then they fly south back into the Gulf of Maine, some of them out on the edge of the continental shelf. And it happened that our discovery coincided with a movement during the end of President Obama's presidency to create a marine monument over an extremely diverse area called the Coral Canyons and Seamounts. This discovery of where Maine puffins went, that they joined tuna and whales and sea turtles and everything else in the food chain out there, was no big surprise because it is a very rich area. But it helped to, puffins helped to give impetus for creating that national monument. Now we're hoping to keep the fishing fleets out of it, because keeping that area a rich place that's producing fish for seabirds is very important for seabirds. Little fish became increasingly of interest to me as we sat out on the Puffin Islands. You know, when you're sitting there like for 8 years wondering if the puffins are going to come back. And in all honesty, I was not personally sitting there for 8 years, but our project was there, and there were people sitting there waiting for the. We had lots of time to start looking at what the birds were doing, and the birds were, in fact, depending upon little fish. We saw them first in the puffin's beak, and later we began to realize they most of the birds we were interested in eat little fish. These are Arctic terns, a species that was also missing. And after the puffin started nesting there, I began starting to think, well, is there a time when we can leave this island and this island will be self-sustaining in some way? And I realized that puffins usually nest under an umbrella of terns. Terns are very aggressive. They chase away gulls. They chase away eagles and other predators. And maybe if I could bring the terns back, they would be the protectors of this newly restored puffin colony. That was my initial idea. And I also realized that terns were in trouble. They had not repopulated islands in Maine for about 50 years, in part because they were shoved off by all the gulls. So we began using decoys, our newly discovered trick. And we created decoy colonies by putting out wooden decoys. And for the first time, we started playing audio playbacks of bird calls. And we didn't play just anything, by the way. We picked courtship calls. We wanted this to be a happy place. Not the aggressive calls that terns do when they're diving and trying to chase you away, but no, tern courtship calls were played, and we discovered an interesting thing. When you do this, the male terns will often be moved to present gifts to the decoys. This wasn't going to go anywhere fast. These relationships would never get off the ground. So, also discovered that the terns would try and often chase away these decoys, and they would try to chase them. And we also discovered that decoys didn't need to look a whole lot like terns. This one I call my essence of tern decoy. Just the basics. Just the basics. Anybody, even a low-budget tern restoration project could do something useful with this. And I began realizing, this is, earlier somebody asked me when the aha moments happen, and there have been many, but this was one of them, when we began realizing that we were really onto something here. Because when we did this, first at Eastern Egg Rock and later at other islands, there's been about a dozen islands on this coast where this method, now called social attraction, is used. We realized we were onto something that was bigger than Egg Rock. I had no idea at the time that this would become a method used around the world, but it has. It's called social attraction, and it's something that was invented right here in Miscongas Bay that's helping seabirds worldwide now, including endangered species right in our own backyard. This is a federally endangered, these are roseate terns. There's only a couple of hundred pairs of these in the whole state of Maine, but I'm pleased to tell you that every one of those protected pairs is now on a protected island. Prior to this project, they were nesting on islands where they were being eaten by predators and they were being washed over by big seas. Now they're at least nesting in wildlife sanctuaries like Egg Rock, which supports about half of the state population. And they nest on several other islands. Magnificent birds, but very, very rare. As we began listening to what the terns had to say, they taught us an important lesson. Using these little geolocators, tiny ones attached to their legs, they have shown us that Eastern Egg Rock is not an island at all. It is connected to the whole Atlantic Ocean. Let me show you what's going on here. These colors represent the tracks of individual terns. This is Eastern Egg Rock in the middle of this colored area. The yellow tern flew in mid-August, or late July probably, from across the North Atlantic to the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, an area that is turning out to be a very important area for both European and North American birds. Right out here in the middle of the ocean, there's no land there. They stay there for weeks, probably growing new feathers and putting on body weight before they begin the most amazing migration of any bird on the planet. That Arctic tern flew across the equator to Argentina, spent a few days there, went down to Antarctica for the rest of the winter, then flew back to the same spot, and it laid its egg in the exact same spot where it laid it the year before. Some 20,000 miles of migration to lay your egg on the same rock. And we often think of birds flying in flocks, but apparently, in this case, they don't. This pink bird is another Arctic tern, nests near the yellowbird, flies the same spot, migrates down, but it did not go to South America. It went to Africa instead. Then it went way up here into the Indian Ocean, back to Antarctica, probably crossed paths with the yellow tern over here, and then it beelined right back the next spring. Over 30,000 miles for that one. So connecting Eastern Egg Rock to South America and to Africa, to the Indian Ocean, to Antarctica, to me, this map, more than any other map I've seen, shows just how stitched together this planet is. And the migratory pathways over these oceanic flyways is so revealing about how we have to look after the entire ocean. You can't save just one spot when it comes to birds. You have to save it all. Here's another world map. This one relates to the Social Attraction Project, the spread of the use of decoys and sound recordings to other parts of the world. We know now that in at least 14 countries for nearly 50 species of birds have benefited from using decoys for conservation projects. These numbers represent projects. And behind each of these projects is some bird hero, some dedicated person that was committing themselves to trying to make a difference. That I find very hopeful. There are people out there quietly, passionately trying to make a difference for wild birds and seabirds in this case. One of those persons is on my staff. It's Sue Schubel, and she has helped me to spread the word around the world. She's here tonight. I hope you have a chance to talk with her. Here she is painting a decoy. We have found this decoy business so interesting and so helpful that we are now producing these in Bremen and shipping them around the world. Last year we were shipping decoys to South Korea and to Hawaii and to New Zealand and many other locations to help birds in conservation projects. There are mirrors being produced there and shipped around the world as well, because that also is a useful method, and we think that we can be helpful by providing the methods. I wish I had time to tell you all those stories, but I'm going to tell you two of those exciting restoration stories. This is Torishima Island in the south of Japan, where the short-tailed albatross is making its last stand. The short-tailed albatross is one of the world's most spectacular birds, with beautiful golden head and wingspan of over 7 feet. There used to be millions of these. It was the most common albatross in the North Pacific, but people hunted them. They went to the bird nesting islands and they killed almost all of them. This historic picture from Japan shows a feather hunter holding 2 albatross in front of a pile of birds that were killed to remove their feathers, just as we hunted birds on the Maine coast and to decorate hats and to stuff feathers into pillows. This was a worldwide thing. It stopped in Japan, and there are bird heroes in Japan now trying to make a difference. And here's some of them on the slope of this active volcano, and that's the problem. It could explode at any time. And there's less than 1,000 of these birds left, all nesting on that one island. So they're packing them up, just as we did the puffins at Egg Rock. And these are not little fluffy birds. These are big babies. And you don't just drop the food in their burrow either. You have to hold them and give them the food. And are they thankful? I don't know. But they're coming back. They're coming back to a non-volcanic island now where they move these chicks to. And that's exciting. It shows that people are making a difference. This is the future generation of the short-tailed albatross, and it's possible in part because the decoys and the translocation methods are being used in Japan. Just about a week ago, I went to China to see this sister project that we have there that's patterned after the work on the Maine coast. And this is the other project I want to share with you. Most of you have heard of the Ivory-Billed Woodpecker, not here. But the bird in the middle is as rare as an ivory-billed woodpecker was until it was rediscovered just a few years ago. It was thought to be extinct for about 70 years. It's the Chinese crested tern. And it was discovered right in the middle of a colony of great crested terns in Taiwan. You recognize them by the fact they have an orange bill with a black tip, their back is white, and they have a big crest that they put up when they're excited. These birds have many problems, and this is some of the reasons why they were thought to have gone extinct. People were hunting them, taking their eggs, and selling them at fish markets. Rats were introduced onto their islands that were eating their eggs, and giant bird-eating snakes were swimming out to the islands. Against all these odds, is it possible to bring back a bird so rare there's only maybe a few of them? And if that wasn't bad enough, the nesting islands sit right in the middle of a belt of where typhoons come in regularly, right during the nesting season. Bird heroes, people that care, people that want to make a difference. And this is Lu and Fan, 2 Chinese biologists, came to Maine a few years ago to learn about social attraction, to learn about seabird restoration, went home inspired to do their own project. And they've set up a system of tern restoration islands all along the coast, not just in mainland China, and this is the interesting part of this story, in other countries as well, South Korea and in Taiwan, areas that often don't have much to talk about with each other. This bird has united these biologists to come together, to come up with a group plan, knowing that you can't have all the eggs on one basket or this bird is doomed. spreading the risk out to new sites. The same idea behind our project on the Maine coast. And using decoys, adapted here, because of the strong winds, they cemented them inside of blocks of concrete, so that when the winds came, the decoys were still there. I thought that was pretty smart. I like it when people tweak this idea in different places. And did it work? Well, this is a great crested tern that was attracted to the decoy. And Lou and Fawn discovered not just one, but thousands of great crested terns, which is this group here, were attracted because of the decoys. But among them were a few Chinese crested terns. Here's the 2 Chinese crested terns with a little tern chick peeking out. So it's so exciting to see these terns and know that they are thriving. What's their future? Who knows? How long will they have to keep that project going? What happens after Lou and Fawn move on to with somebody else? The same questions that we face here on the Maine coast about keeping these restored colonies going. But it's possible. They made the choice to make a difference. So here in Maine, we've learned a lot from the Puffins about restoration. But now they're telling us other messages. Some of those messages are in my book, so I'm just going to mention that there's a lot more to talk about tonight than I can share with you. I hope you will buy the book, give it to somebody else, give it to a school. Hopefully it will inspire more bird heroes and more heroes for the planet. Here's the latest news from Egg Rock. Remember, it took 8 years to get those first few pairs. It took the next 20 years at Eastern Egg Rock. We sat out there happy that we had puffins, but worried that the colony did not grow. Every year there were about 20 pairs. Part of that is puffins live a long time. They may live to be 30 years old or more. So it was the same birds coming back every year, each year producing another chick. So a few new pairs would replace a few old birds, but the old ones live, like 95% of the adults come back every year. But in the mid-1990s, we started seeing something very different. We started seeing the population of puffins increasing. And last year, it took a big jump to 172 pairs. That was the biggest jump we'd seen. And I'm very happy to share the news tonight that we just set a new record number of puffins, 178 pairs this summer. That's all very encouraging. The population is growing. These are long-lived birds. They keep coming back every year trying to raise a chick. The sister project over on Seal Island, this graph is not as complete as the previous one, but again, 8 years to 1992. The population has increased, and we're over 500 pairs of puffins there. Many more out there than at Eastern Egg Rock. So that's all great news. But we noticed in 2012 on both islands that not as many puffins nested. And that coincided with news that finally started hitting the headlines. Until 2012, this was not front page news, this story about the Gulf of Maine warming up. But now we know the Gulf of Maine is among the fastest warming bodies of ocean in the world. In this map, the red area shows areas that are warming above the average, and you see the Gulf of Maine up here, one of the fastest warming areas. This is the sea surface temperature rising, and especially since about 2004, it's been on the increase, a sharp increase here. Ups and downs, but on average, it's been going up since 2004. We know there's other changes. The plankton bloom, the plankton that feeds everything else in the Gulf of Maine, is not as strong as it used to be before 2004. We know that, and this map shows what it is in April. It shows it in May, after the zooplankton hatch, and they start eating all of this. Just in a month, it goes away. It's transformed into zooplankton. But the phytoplankton are blooming earlier by about 2 weeks than they were in the mid-1980s. And there's now a disjunct between the time when the zooplankton hatch. So the zooplankton is not moving as early as is the phytoplankton on our coast. And that's leading to a fall-off in productivity. How does that affect anything? Well, of course, it affects everything because everything eats plankton. The kinds of plankton is also changing. This blue peak shows this Calanus spinmarchicus, the most fat-rich of the copepods. That's what eats all that plankton, but it's becoming less abundant, replaced by less fatty copepods. So the kinds of copepods and the appearance and the timing is critical because the little fish that the puffins eat are migratory. They're not there year-round. They have to arrive just at the right time to feed the baby puffins. So if you care about puffins, you really have to care about these big fellows. These are the parents of white hake. These are adult white hake. You don't see these swimming around on the inshore waters because they live at the edge of the continental shelf. They're out there in the coral canyons and seamounts. And the little ones do this amazing migration. They swim all by themselves with that little tail. They swim from out of the continental shelf up into the bays, and they arrive just about the time that the puffin chicks are hatching. And that's why the favorite food for puffins on Midcoast Maine are these little white hake. Without the big ones, without their protection, the food for puffins will fall off. There's other things that are happening as well. You hear about climate change. I don't know, and you hear about the greenhouse effect. But there's lots more going on here. The greenhouse effect, of course, is the gases that we produce from burning carbon, that trap heat. But on the New England coast, there's more rain, and the precipitation has been on the increase. And that's causing colloids to float off of the mainland. It's clouding the water. It's blocking sunlight that the plankton needs to feed the little fish. The other thing that's happening is the water temperature is increasing. The fish are moving lower and further away from the nesting islands. So just a degree or two change in sea surface temperature causes the fish, already stressed by less plankton, to move deeper and further away. These are some of the mechanisms that demonstrate, I think, how complicated all of this is. But it starts with our changing climate. Climate change is key to puffins surviving here. This is the egg Rock Hilton. This is, if you go to Google Earth and you zoom in to Eastern Egg Rock, it's actually there. It says Egg Rock Hilton. It's a real place on the landscape. It's the outermost house in Muscongas Bay. We rode in a dory the parts of this from the mainland and put it together out there, and miraculously it's survived ever since it was rowed out there in 1979. It was originally the shelter for the puffin keepers, the ones that were feeding the little Newfoundland puffin chicks. Today, it's still occupied by the group of research assistants, affectionately called the Puffineers, who live in there and are still the puffin keepers. We have not transplanted puffins to Eastern Egg Rock since 1986. You saw the growth curve. We don't have to anymore. They're thriving out there. The population is growing. But the puffin research assistants these days are our front line to make sure that they stay safe from predators and that we listen to what they have to say, what the puffins have to say about climate change. These puffin chicks that were reared on Eastern Egg Rock this summer are benefiting from that whole food chain that I just talked about. It takes over 2,000 little fish to raise one of these little puffins to the point of fledging. And if they don't get enough food, they'll be underweight. And they'll head off to sea with less of a chance of coming back. This has been a summer of warmer water. And once again, we're seeing lower weight puffin chicks heading out from all three of our seabird nesting islands. Will they come back? We hope so. At least they're going out. Elsewhere in the puffin's wide range, like in Iceland and in Norway, there are puffin colonies where they have not been successful for over a decade now because of climate change. These very sensitive sentinels of the ocean are telling us there's big changes happening in the ocean. And their ability to adapt is going to be key. In the Egg Rock Hilton, the Egg Rock Cafe, if you will, we're entering the data that we learn by sitting in observation blinds. Here's how we do it. The research assistants go out in the morning or in the afternoon, and they sit in one of these little boxes. If you go on a hardy boat trip, you'll see the little bird blinds. They're only 3 foot square. We walk down pathways to get in these bird blinds, sit on a bucket for 3 hours inside of that blind. With a very good camera, you can take pictures like that. And you can actually count the number of fish in their beaks. And you know what kind of fish they are. And you know how long they are by comparing to the length of the beak. And we can tell whether it's a good year or a bad year for puffins by the amount of food. And by the way, because I know somebody's going to ask, I'll tell you all right now. They catch all those fish by opening their beak, holding the first fish up with their tongue, dropping the lower mandible down, snatch more and more and more until they get a nice catch like that. The world record is 61 fish in one catch. I know somebody wondered about that. Those are white hake. These are Atlantic herring, the best of the fish. It doesn't take as many herring to feed a puffin chick, and herring by its nature is a fatty fish. It's good for people to eat. It's also good for puffins to eat. And how do puffins catch these fish? They dive down, they fly with their wings out, and they chase them. And they try to catch as many as they can. And if a puffin chick is fortunate enough to see a meal like this come into its burrow, that's a good day for the puffin. And that puffin will grow quickly. And it'll leave the burrow and head off to sea. In a warm year, like this year, we didn't see hardly any herring coming back. The herring were probably too deep, or they swam further away. What we did see instead were what I call junk food. These are sticklebacks, little hake. That's a puffer fish. This is a butterfish. Butterfish are a warmer water fish, more common in the mid-Atlantic states. They move up here into the Gulf of Maine. When the water temperature warms, we see more of them. And especially toward the end of this summer, we saw a lot of those coming back. When a puffin chick tries to swallow a butterfish, the problem is it just doesn't fit. This is an interesting phenomenon. You might wonder, why doesn't the parent do something? Look, there's mom or dad sitting there in the entranceway to the burrow, and the chick can't swallow it. It doesn't have the behavior. It's not like an osprey that it's going to tear it up. It doesn't have the equipment or the behavior. That's up to the chick to try to get that fish down, and they try. Their life depends upon it. Sometimes they can, sometimes they can't. But there's good news in the diet studies at Egg Rock. One of the good news is that we're seeing this little fish showing up. In some years, 3 years ago, these pointy-tailed little fish called Acadian redfish made up over half of the food fed to puffin chicks at Egg Rock. It's a fish that was actually itself on the endangered species list because it was so overfished on this coast. It's been protected since 1976 by regulations through the Magnuson-Stevens Fisheries Act, an act that itself is now endangered, and we're hoping that it will be renewed stronger than ever and not weakened. Redfish, the fishery was closed, but now it's been reopened, and the redfish population is growing. You may know this as ocean perch. You see it in the grocery stores. It's a sustainably harvested fish now, a good choice for people and for puffins. And the other new item on the puffins' diet these days is haddock. The same haddock that we eat in the stores has the same story of overfishing, and now it's a recovering fish stock. So there are over a dozen different kinds of fish stocks on the New England coast that have benefited and are on the recovery. So there are some good news stories out there. Taking care of our fish stocks is very important. But how long are we going to have to keep the seabirds protected? How long will the interns live on the islands? We know that if we weren't out there, the gulls would quickly come back. And so would now the eagles. This is a picture of the Rock Hilton with the windows shut, and as soon as we leave, eagles come out there and sit there to eat whatever they can. They stay away while we're there, but they come. A few years ago, we thought of this great idea. Maybe we could fool them to think that we were still there even after we left. But the gull started sitting on its head. And it was a humbling experience for me to go all the trouble to build a robot that would get out of a box and look mean, but it wasn't mean at all. It was a case of underestimating the intelligence of gulls, and I can tell you, they're very smart. What it takes are people, because the gulls recognize people. They recognize individual people. They know who their friends are and who might take their eggs or take a shot at them if they act up in the wrong way. And so keeping our biologists on the island is an important thing. Not only does it protect the birds, but it gives biologists a jump start in their careers, an experience they can use to move on to the next experience and on to careers in conservation biology. And I can tell you, we need these people more than ever every day. It's inspiring to me to be around our interns and to learn from them and to see how they are benefiting by living among the birds. Keeping them there helps keep the birds there, and it's making the planet a better place. And that's the same mission for the Hog Island Audubon Camp that brought me to Maine in 1969. If you haven't been here, I hope you will come, because this is a place where you can actively become engaged. It's been here teaching people about birds and conservation and having real experiences on islands with some of the best naturalists of our time. Some of the hands-on projects we do through the Audubon Camp are directly benefiting Egg Rock. This is our Rhodes Scholar program that goes out the first week of September. Here they are putting vegetation barriers down to block invasive plants from overrunning tern nesting habitat. They created these patches where birds can nest. They've also helping us solve this problem. This is a guillemot entangled in a lobster trap. The Audubon campers have helped us do big cleanups on Egg Rock, and we're doing other cleanups on other islands along this coast. The problems of lobster gear is the biggest massive bit of plastic on the coast. It's not a bit, it's a huge amount. And what happens to it is really a big problem for seabirds, because all this breaks up and it gets into the food chain. And it gets into the food that the seabirds eat. And seabirds can, as you've seen from the plastic ocean, die from choking and entanglement. Getting these traps back either into landfills where they're safe, or better yet, being to places. Here's Vinyl Haven Island, a lobsterman picking over traps and gear that were brought to Vinyl Haven so he could pick through and look for his gear and salvage some of this. These are recycled. Some of it can be recycled and turned back into raw materials. It's all in the right direction. But everybody has an impact. And here's just an example about one of the problems we see way out on the islands are these mylar balloons released from birthday parties that float ashore, occasionally entangling birds like this razorbill. So not releasing these things, picking them up when you find them, along with other plastics, is a step that can directly benefit seabirds. I think engaging people with seabirds is so important, because they live on these remote islands, far away from us. Who would know the beauty of these birds unless you actually get out and see them? And fortunately, we have this relationship with a hardy boat that every night that the weather will possibly permit, the hardy boat, well named, goes out and circles eastern Egg Rock with Audubon naturalists on board to share their experiences. They've been living on the islands with the birds, and they can share their stories and help you spot the birds and understand them better. I think understanding is the place to start, and maybe from understanding will follow caring and making a difference. person by person. But still, not everybody can be on the Hardy boat. That's why we have this arrangement with explore.org. As you were coming in, you saw the video on the screen. Those were some of the live highlights from our online cameras. If you haven't seen them, they're really amazing. There are 5 cameras way out on the CO Island colony showing the world what we've accomplished there. There's even one inside of a burrow, so you can see the chick inside the burrow day by day. And this helps, I think, engage more people with seabirds and their world. So this little puffin chick that showed me the way to learning about seabird restoration, that showed me that it's possible to spread the risk by starting colonies, that showed me that we don't have to just be witnesses to extinctions and extirpations. It's not just about holding the line. We can possibly expand ranges for wildlife. We can help them survive storms and oil spills and even climate change, helping them to adapt if we do the right thing at the right places and we do it long enough. And now they're telling us about changes in the world from climate change. And seabirds are telling us about plastics. If we listen to these birds, we can understand that each of us can truly make a difference. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Where are my runners?
So questions. Happy to answer any questions.
So I just have to say, I love the whole idea of bird heroes. I just think I just love that. All right.
Okay, great. Thank you.
The graph was very dramatic. Do you have a theory what happened between 1996 and 99 to see that number of pairs increase? Did you feed them fatter fish, or what happened?
So the big increase we saw at Egg Rock, I think, probably was a result of good conditions at sea for chicks. Those were very productive years. The ocean was cold. It was full of the right kinds of plankton, right kinds of fish, and chicks were growing up and coming back in very high rates. We know that, amazing enough, some of the groups of puffins that were fledging from Matinicus Rock during those years, 90% of them were surviving. And big colony on Matinicus Rock, and also a much larger colony on Machias Seal on the Canadian border, were producing lots of chicks. And some of them found their way to Egg Rock. And then it became kind of a snowball effect. And I think that really applies here because birds don't want to be in small colonies. They want to be in a bigger colony. And the bigger Egg Rock got, the more it attracted. And I think we're still seeing that effect happening. Yeah.
Yes, hi. 2 questions. The first one, I presume that when they go up to Canada, they follow the coastline. They don't go the direct route.
So you're asking about the pathway to Canada. We have no idea.
Really? Okay.
Yeah. We don't know exactly whether they're flying along the coast. My hunch is they do.
Yeah.
Because puffins like to be near water. Yeah.
All right. And then the second part is looking at that amazing migratory pattern. Is there some greater part of the ecology that causes that, or are they just following food, or does it have some greater use or purpose?
Well, okay, so they're flying, the Arctic terns are flying from the northern hemisphere to the southern hemisphere because they can't stay in the northern hemisphere. It's just too cold for them to find the food. So,
but they go north first. I found that
they do fly out the mid-Atlantic ridge. So the details of that migration have mostly to do with air currents.
Okay.
And they are using tailwinds. There are global air streams. And if you overlay that kind of map with global air streams, it's amazing that they're taking advantage of air currents in
Sure.
both the southward and the northward. But there's ability to follow different currents, so some of them end up going to Africa and some go to South America.
A real tailwind.
It's all about the tailwind. Yeah. You don't want to fly into a headwind if you're a seabird. Yeah.
How do the healthy populations of puffins further north survive without graduate students?
Okay, the question is, do all colonies need puffin protectors? No, the big colonies in Canada and Iceland don't have people out there chasing away predators. Once a colony gets to a certain size, it can handle a certain amount of predation, even from peregrines. But our colonies in Maine are still very small. Perhaps they'll get to the point someday where they can, but we're a long way from that at this point. And tied to your question might also be, long ago, before Europeans came and started killing off the puffins, how did this system work? Because these are all native birds. Puffins are native, gulls are native, eagles are native. They were all here, somehow living together. And I think the missing piece, the big change between that pre-colonial period and now, was the amount of fish in the water. Back in the pre-colonial days, the rivers were not dammed. There was huge movements of alewives and river-run herring, and there were big predators eating those fish. There were just a lot more fish. So today, bird-eating predators, like eagles, are eating other birds, but long ago, eagles were probably eating mostly fish, and so were gulls. Yes?
I was just wondering if, well, first of all, thank you. Wonderful presentation, and thank you for everything that you do. I was wondering if there was predation with that one egg or with the chick, would they re-nest? Would they lay another egg?
Puffins?
Yes.
So if a puffin loses its egg, it usually, if it loses it late in the incubation period, or if it loses chick, it will not relay in that year because it's such a long incubation period.
Is it possible to remove the egg early on and then get it to relay and then
So in bird
incubate?
conservation, for rare species, often the egg is taken in an early stage, it's incubated, and with the hope that the bird will relay an egg. That probably would happen with puffins if it was taken early enough. But in our project, because the birds were not so rare and we wanted to minimize the amount of human disturbance, we skipped over the whole incubation stage, moved right to chicks. Yeah.
Do we know anything about the location of the little fish, where they have gone, or if they're fished out, not producing, moving north? Any ideas?
The general idea is that when the water warms up, the little fish that normally are within the top, say, 50 feet of the water, where puffins and terns can easily get to them, they're moving either deeper or they're moving further out toward the ocean. Now that is an annual event, but over many years, many species of fish are shifting their ranges further north. And that's another cause of concern. We're hoping some southern fish of the right size will maybe move into our area, just not too many butterfish, which is an example of a southern fish moving in. It's the wrong size. So, yeah, that's probably, there's two things going on. There's range changes, and there's also annual changes. Yeah. Any other questions?
You mentioned that these puffins, or the little puffins, are actually pretty good about taking handouts. What about continuing feeding them now when there is a bad small fish here?
So most of the puffins are nesting under big boulders where we really can't get to them at all, even if we wanted to try to feed them. So they're just really out, they're inaccessible, and it's not a practical approach. We can't get to them. We can pull a few out to weigh and measure a small sample, but the majority of them are out of sight. And the other problem is that even if they were fed, they would be heading out into a sea that's warm, and there's not a lot of food out there right now.
Thank you for the presentation. I'm curious, so the researchers are out there. What opportunities are there for volunteers?
We do have every summer some volunteers. I have to tell you that it's not for everybody. Living on a treeless, exposed island with winds that can go over 60 miles an hour and blow tents flat and have the cacophony of bird sounds and bird guano around you. But for the right person, we do sometimes have people. And if you go to Project Puffin, you'll find a pathway to our volunteer program. We look for people that are good at camping and wilderness experiences and willing to commit at least 2-3 weeks of their time to this project. Other questions? Yep.
What would you say the estimated capacity of Seal Island and Eastern Egg is for nesting pairs?
The estimated capacity of the island, I'd say Egg Rock could grow to hundreds of pairs. And Seal Island, probably thousands of pairs. It will be limited eventually by the amount of food around the island. So I don't think nesting habitat is necessarily going to be the first thing to limit the populations. On the Machias Seal Island on the U.S.-Canadian border up near Machias, there is a colony of over 5,000 pairs on islands only about twice the size of eastern Egg Rock. And that's because puffins love to nest near each other. There's safety in numbers, and maybe they even share information about where the food is. And so there's benefits of living together. Yeah. Great questions. Here's one right up here.
Apart from your intent to manage moving populations into new islands, have you seen any opportunistic migration of the animal of puffins into other islands that you've not actively managed?
So we have, since this project started, seen puffins colonize Petit Manan Island up near Millbridge. It was never a historic colony that we know of, but it was a restored tern colony, and they saw the terns and figured they'd give it a try, and there's 60 or so pair there. That's a naturally created colony. And we've seen at least one pair on Great Duck Island off of Bar Harbor. So, and that pair showed up on its own. So this is pretty exciting that we not only have brought them back, but the population is growing to the point now where it's starting to spread out here and there. In total, there are we think about 1,300 pairs of puffins on the mid-coast of Maine these days. Yeah. I've got a question right there.
Thanks for the talk, super inspiring. You said that terns kind of scare away predators because they're super aggressive. Have you considered putting them on Egg Island?
We have terns on eastern Egg Rock now. Yeah,
okay. Do they help?
So the problem with that idea was that the terns get back after the gulls. The gulls get there first, and then the terns come along later. Once the terns are established, they do help, but the terns need a helping hand to get established, and that's why we have tried to get that colony going first. So we think that the terns are part of the solution, but not enough to be there by themselves. Maybe one more question, and then we'll call it a wrap. There's one right there.
Have you ever considered drone technology to help keep eagles in such a way when you're not physically present?
So have we considered drones to keep eagles away? I don't. My hunch is it wouldn't work for that purpose, because first of all, the drones get attacked by birds, including the terns. So yeah, and they can be disturbing if they're not being attacked. So I don't think they themselves are particularly frightening. So I think I'm going to be over here at the book signing table. Be happy to sign some. I want to again thank the Lincoln Theater for making their facility available to us, and I want to thank the Hardy Boat for helping us to keep the puffins out there. Part of your donation, if you go on the Hardy Boat, comes right to Project Puffin. Helps keep those interns living out on the island, and I hope that if you're interested in adopting a puffin, or if you're which we can make possible. Actually, if you'd like to adopt an intern too, that's possible. Sponsorships of our college-age biologists is a reality. And yeah, go on the trips, come out to see the islands, watch the birds, talk to people about climate change, talk to them about plastics in the ocean, think about things, even small things are important to do. Action is what is most important. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve.